I'm not planning to thank the organizers. In fact, I don't know if there is any organizer sitting here because they have squashed me between three professors, and that's not fair, actually. So, in any case, I'm not even going to pretend talking about and trying to teach you how to do a critical care management of an ICU patient. All I'm going to do is to give you some practical points as we go along to help you with a child who has got acute liver failure, which is quite a devastating illness. Thankfully, not so common. You see, what I'm going to teach you today, I was not taught 25 years ago. And 10 years from now, this talk is going to be useless. You're going to be talking about different things. You can talk about hepatocyte transplants and stuff like that. So there's nothing etched in stone, okay? Keep that in mind. So if you just remember what I'm talking about for the next, let's say, a day or two, that's good enough, because it's going to change next week in any case. Undoubtedly, the current treatment of choice for advanced liver failure, acute or chronic, remains a liver transplantation. Undoubtedly. Unfortunately, in a country like ours, where a large majority of the patients don't have access to a transplant, be it monetary, be it donors, be it access to a transplant center, that is not possible. So what are you going to do? You've got to provide the best possible critical care management. You also know that most of the children that we see with acute liver failure don't have any specific therapy available for them, in the hope that the liver regenerates and your child will get better and go home. So what I'm going to do in the next 15-20 minutes is to go down this whole list, and we're going to start with definitions first. Traditionally, liver failure has been divided up into acute, subacute, or chronic, depending upon the timeline. So when the illness was less than 8 weeks, it was called acute. When the illness was 8 weeks to 6 months, it's called subacute. And that's kind of very peculiar to our country, because we tend to see a lot more subacute hepatic failure than that was seen in the West. Within the acute liver failure, we have another category called the hyperacute liver failure, basically in which the child developed encephalopathy within 7 days of developing jaundice. Now this is actually a very, intuitively, most people would have thought that, oh my God, there's a serious disease and the child is going to die. No, that's not true. In fact, this is probably the best prognostic category. Could be related to the fact that these children actually have got either acetaminophen or paracetamol poisoning or hepatitis A, both having good prognostic markers. Over the last 15 or 20 years, it's now clear that assessing hepatic encephalopathy in children, especially young children, infants, newborns, is extremely difficult. And another point, 15 to 20% of children with acute liver failure will die without developing encephalopathy. So there's been a change in the definition of acute liver failure. It was published in 2008, and this is now going to be, at least for the next several years, going to be the standard. So there is biochemical evidence of liver injury. There's a PT-INR of more than 2 without encephalopathy, or PT-INR of more than 1.5 with encephalopathy. That's corrected. You have given them vitamin K. And there's no evidence of chronic liver disease. So this is the definition of acute liver failure as of now, and that's what we should be following, so that there is some sort of comparison data available. Moving along, over the years, the biggest complaint, the biggest grouse, most legal suits have been filed against doctors just because the parents were not counseled enough, or rather I should say were not educated enough about the disease. But over the years, I have also seen that this is the fastest improving sector that we have, especially in the corporate hospitals. I do understand that there would be pressures of time in other hospitals, but in most corporate hospitals, there is now time dedicated for counseling and educating the parent or the family that you have identified. I think it's really important that you are upfront about this disease with the parents, with the family, and you be as accurate as possible. And I'm just going to go over the prognostic markers in a bit. I don't think you should be afraid to use the D word, the death word. You need to tell them that your child is in this is category, and this is the likelihood of this child dying. And I actually do tell them that start getting the money organized for a transplant, because the insurance penetration in our country is only 3 or 4%. So majority of the patients will be paying from out of pocket. Even though I've been in this so-called business for last 10, 15 years, I still find it difficult to get an assessment from the family that I'm dealing with, whether they'll be able to generate that much money so quickly to save their child. And I don't want them to feel guilty. It is a big problem, but I guess we have to face these realities. So let's just look at the poor prognostic factors right away. In my mind, late onset of encephalopathy, we see these children. Child's been having jaundice for 2 weeks and now gets encephalopathy. I think this is probably the single most important poor prognostic marker. If a child has a persistently elevated PT, there was a study that showed that if the INR was persistently elevated more than 4, only 16% survived, versus those in which the INR was persistently less than 4, 3/4 survived. As a matter of fact, if you go back and look at the transplant criteria of the King's College, they have a criteria only for INR. If your INR is persistently more than 6.5, you need to transplant the patient. Only 15% or 20% of children who go into grade 4 encephalopathy will actually recover. And this is probably that group which follows in the hyperacute liver failure category. There are now other studies that show a combination of hepatic encephalopathy, PT values, ALT values, that puts them in the bad category. And of course, another big category that we see in our country, Wilson's disease. Wilson's disease is probably the single most important metabolic disease in our country. So if a child comes to us with encephalopathy, very likely he will die without a transplant. Before we go ahead with the patient, let's just talk about some family-related issues. Many years ago, I had a 14-year-old boy who died of acute hepatic failure due to hepatitis A. He died within 3 or 4 days of coming to the hospital, and unfortunately, 3 weeks later, they brought their younger son also with acute hepatic failure. Now, you can imagine that if the second child had also died, it would have been devastating not only for me, for the family. It's unbelievable that 2 children died within 1 month of a vaccine-preventable disease. I learned that day, and I make sure that each time I see a child with acute hepatitis with hepatitis A or acute hepatic failure because of hepatitis A, that I get the sibling in and get them vaccinated or immunoglobulin. We can discuss about that later. That's a different discussion. But you've got to protect the sibling. If your child has got hepatitis B, you obviously got to look at the others. If there's a family death or this child has got Wilson's disease, you've got to look at the other family members. And if a child has OD'd on paracetamol, there may be something going on in the family. That's something that we forget about, and we don't get our psychologists and psychiatrists involved in time. Okay, so moving on now to history and investigations. I think one of the things I do tell my senior residents that who come in, or DNB students who I work with, when they do see an acute hepatic failure patient, is don't panic. Because in general, there's a huge chaos when you see a patient like this. And the chaos is essentially because it's a rare disease. There's a definite risk of death. And then there is this new angle that has come in the last maybe 7 or 8 years in our country of liver transplantation. So the first thing is to avoid chaos and push the child into the ICU. There's less chaos there. You have to have a clinical assessment. You've got to take a good history. You can't forget that. You've got to look at the duration, obvious cause, complications that could have happened because of acute hepatic failure. You've got to look at the treatment. Recently, we had a child who we could not find any cause of acute hepatic failure. He eventually died, except for ingestion of nimesulide. Now, I don't know whether that is the cause of his death or not, but certainly we have many case reports where nimesulide has caused acute hepatic failure. Also remember that just because a hepatitis A vaccine has been given doesn't mean that your child who's come in with liver failure cannot have hepatitis A, because no vaccine is 100% protective. And don't forget, you've got to clinically examine your patient once in a while. There are patients, the family members will come and tell me, but doctor, you've come in the evening and nobody's examined this child all day. And I said, no, I see notes here. The child has been examined. You may have been gone out for a cup of tea. So no, I didn't go for any cup of tea. I was right here. Nobody's examined this child. So please don't forget that. Use the hammer sometimes. Use a stethoscope. Use your hands. What about the investigations? Now, you'll be sending standard investigations as you would send for any child in the ICU. And a favorite question of mine is to these students, DNB students, senior residents, what's the first test you will do when the child is wheeled into your casualty or into your ICU with acute hepatic failure. And most people tell me prothrombin time. Of course, prothrombin time is very important. It's part of the definition. It has to be sent. But I think people do miss out sometimes on the sugar. I also want to tell you about phosphorus. Phosphorus is an important marker. In fact, phosphorus is now considered as one of the prognostic markers for liver failure. Lower your phosphorus levels, higher the chance that you will get better. The theory being that the phosphorus is being sucked up by the regenerating hepatocytes. So if you have got bad-looking kid, grade 3, grade 4 encephalopathy, high phosphorus levels, chances are that he's not going to make it. Also, I should tell you that when you see bilirubin levels more than 30, think that there's something else going on. And the most common would be either a hemolytic anemia, sepsis, or a concomitant renal failure, which is extremely common with acute liver failure. I used to work at a hospital in New York City, and in the morning rounds, one particular gentleman attending would come in and ask, can you please tell me what is the worst number Bob has today? Now it's important. Our technology is improved. We have to look at numbers. Bloods are sent off at 6 in the morning. But you can't forget your senses. You can leave taste out, but other senses you have to have on and make a correct assessment and then move ahead. If you look at the etiology of acute liver failure from the West, this is an amalgamation of almost 300 odd patients from 19 centers over a 5-year period in US, Canada, and the UK. A large number, almost 49%, there was no cause known. Infections made up a very small number. Paracetamol poisoning made up approximately 12 to 14%, and then there was spattering of metabolic. What about India? This is an amalgamation of 3 studies I put in here. All these studies were done before 2002, and the N was 142. And you'll see that 50% has hepatitis A associated with it. Another 15 or 16% was hepatitis E, 12% hepatitis B. And then there's chronic liver disease that presented with as an acute manifestation drug, of which for us anti-tubercular treatment, ATT, INH is number 1. And of course there were some unknowns. So what I've learned as a medical graduate at AIIMS was that common things are common. Uncommon presentations of common diseases are more common than uncommon diseases per se. I'm sure you follow that, you understand that. So, what are the specific tests you're going to send is dependent on your etiology. You're going to be sending hepatitis A, hepatitis E, hepatitis core IgM, and hepatitis B studies. And in the last year, I've seen 6 or 7 children, mostly infants, less than 14 months, who had dengue. And that's being reported now from many parts of the country and the world. This was not seen previously, and that's why it was missing in the previous studies. Of course, you can have drug toxicity. Autoimmune hepatitis can present as acute liver failure in less than 5% of patients. Some metabolic disorders. This is important to pick up because some of these disorders are contraindications for liver transplantation. As is malignancy, leukemia, acute leukemia can present with liver failure. So you've got to make sure that you're looking at the peripheral smear accurately. I haven't talked about one very important disease, and that's Wilson disease. I mentioned to you early on about Wilson disease. And that is a child who usually presents to us with liver failure and hemolysis. Of course, there are many other causes of hemolysis, and the most common that we find in North India at least is G6PD deficiency. Malaria, sepsis can cause hemolysis. And it's important to pick this up because you can probably prevent at least pigment nephropathy, and I think Professor Zimmerman may talk about it later. And also because even though plasmapheresis and chelation therapy might protect your child with acute Wilson's crisis, but very likely he will need a transplantation. One thing that you should keep in mind is that if you see a child with acute liver failure who has a very low alkaline phosphatase, think Wilson's. In newborns, infants, the etiology is slightly different. We don't see so many patients of this disease. But herpes, neonatal hemochromatosis, which incidentally is not an acute disease, it's a chronic disease but presents acutely, metabolic disease are probably number 1 causes. What about liver biopsy? Liver biopsy in acute liver failure when there's coagulopathy is dangerous, it's difficult to do, and probably not so useful. Of course, there are studies of transjugular liver biopsies, but these are done in very select centers in select patients. It's not standard of care. Moving on to treatment, of course, you're going to provide them the standard ICU care. You're going to try and prevent or treat the complications that's happened because of the liver failure and provide specific therapy, if any. So besides the critical care monitoring that you're going to do, neurological monitoring 4-hourly, blood sugar monitoring, you may need restraints because children with encephalopathy rapidly go from stage 1 to 2 and in which they may get combative. You need to have ventral support available, and of course you're going to be putting your lines if the child is worsening. So as a standard, you'll start maintenance IV fluids or 2/3 maintenance IV fluids with 10% D with potassium and sodium, and then you're going to keep changing depending upon what your metabolites, electrolytes show. You're going to put them on medicine to protect them from GI bleed, and you're going to be giving them vitamin K as that's part of the definition. Now, liver failure causes multiple complications, the most important being cerebral edema, number 1 cause of death in these patients, and number 2 cause is sepsis. Of course, you have encephalopathy, renal failure, coagulopathy to deal with as well. This is a kind of table that looks at encephalopathy going from grade 1 to grade 4 here. You find it in every textbook available. What I really want to tell you is that when you have grade 3 or grade 4 encephalopathy, you also have high likelihood of having cerebral edema, and that's the time when you should probably be considering elective ventilation and transfer to a center, if feasible, for transplantation. If your child does not have encephalopathy, or you want to protect him from getting a high degree of encephalopathy, and same with cerebral edema, there are a few things that you could do. And that's, I think, really important. Avoiding aggressive diuresis, avoiding too much of fluids or sedatives, and if the child has bled, getting the blood out of the GI tract. Cerebral edema is, I'm sure there are sessions on cerebral edema in this critical care meeting, so there's not much point for me to talk about, but I think keeping the head elevated, keeping the child in a quiet room, getting your best and most experienced nurse to be with the child all the time, avoiding pain, and if the child is being ventilated, prolonged hypocapnia or vigorous suctioning probably goes a long way. Now, the standard of care in the past has been lactulose and oral antibiotics to reduce encephalopathy. Unfortunately, benefits for this have never been demonstrated, but we continue to use it. And I think in a country where transplant is not freely available, I would still continue to use lactulose, even though there is lack of definite response. The concern with lactulose is abdominal distension. That can create trouble subsequently. Rifaximin is now the oral antibiotic of choice, at least in adults. Unfortunately, there are no studies in children, but soon I think we will see studies in children in acute liver failure, probably the drug of choice now. The other point about intracranial tension is that how to monitor. We just heard about the monitoring of pressures in the abdomen. Monitoring pressures in the head is even more difficult. As you know, papilledema is not seen in a large majority of patients because it develops very quickly. And if you see edema on a CT scan, then it is severe, then it's bad news. People have used the bolt, the intracranial bolt. It's controversial, it's difficult, bleeding infections happen, and I'm really not sure whether it has actually helped save lives. Another modality that has been used is the transcranial Doppler. It's a non-invasive modality, but somehow our radiologists are not willing to take up this space, and I think we just have to push them a little harder, at least in India. The treatment of cerebral edema is again very well known to you. The concept now is to maintain a high sodium value, use mannitol or hypertonic saline. Intermittently, you can increase the ventilation to reduce the CO2 pressures. That could help. We do know that seizures can increase intracranial pressures, and you want to, in grade 3 or grade 4 encephalopathy, give them prophylactic anticonvulsants. Again, the data on this is a little controversial. Hypothermia and phenobarbital has been tried in adults, but we are still waiting for some good randomized studies in children. Sepsis remains the second most important cause of death. And I would recommend putting every child on a cephalosporin, fluoxetine if lines are in place, plus fluconazole, or you can use a carbapenem with fluconazole. Please avoid aminoglycosides. Renal failure is a big issue in liver failure, and you don't want to push that. In many hospitals, I see that you see a PT-INR of, let's say, 30 seconds, or roughly INR of 3, and FFP started. It's not required, it adds to the fluids, and it doesn't help the patient. But if the child is bleeding, there's no question, you have to give FFP. My own feeling about this is that if your INR is touching 6, that means your PT is 60 seconds, and you have decided that you are going to do a transplant, or you have decided that you are not going to do a transplant, give FFP. If you have not decided and you're watching the PT-INR to see the response, then you are watching it. Then giving FFP is going to cloud your judgment. Renal failure I will not talk about because I think it's going to be talked in the next session. I would just mention, please avoid nephrotoxic drugs. And one important thing. In some hospitals where you don't have automated biochemistry machines, when you have very high bilirubin levels, creatinine is recorded as falsely low. So you have a child in liver failure who's having oliguria, and your creatinine levels are not going up, there's a miss if the bilirubin is above 40, by and large. The consensus now is that in most diseases, we can feed the child and we can use the gut. I'm not going to spend much time here. So if your child is taking orally, that's great. If he's not taking orally, pass an NG tube down if he's not bleeding. N-acetylcysteine till a few years ago was the standard of care for acetaminophen or paracetamol toxicity. The good news about it is that two. One is that you can actually use it beyond 24 hours of paracetamol ingestion, and now it has become a standard of care for any liver failure. So you can use this in all your patients with liver failure. Specific therapy is mostly known to all of you. I've listed some of them down. Treatment for herpes is acyclovir, paracetamol is N-acetylcysteine, galactosemia is just avoidance of lactose, tyrosinemia, NTBC is available. It is actually a pesticide or a rodenticide that blocks the enzyme above the intermediates which are toxic. Autoimmune hepatitis, steroids. There's a controversy about using lamivudine in hepatitis B. Wilson's disease, if you have no choice, you will chelate them, and you may want to try plasmapheresis. I've never seen a child with mushroom poisoning. And sometimes with drug-induced hepatotoxicity, steroids and immunoglobulins might do. Ornithine L-citrulline has been used in many parts of the world. I think US, Canada do not have this product, and we are not sure about its efficacy. There is some concern now and some studies showing that it actually may increase ammonia levels, so it's probably best avoided. So we've talked about a lot of things to give, what not to give. Paracetamol to a child with liver failure, don't give, avoid it. NSAIDs, opioids except if it's short-acting, aminoglycosides, aggressive fluids and diuretics, FFP when it's not indicated, corticosteroids. Few studies have shown that it has not helped, but it is something to think about, and certainly it is indicated in autoimmune hepatitis. And please don't give false hope. That's really sad. Coming to transplant considerations, I'm just coming to the end of my talk. If your child is getting drowsy or more lethargic, moving from grade 2 to grade 3, if he has an increasing bilirubin or an increasing PT, or he has Wilson's crisis, or he's developing hepatorenal syndrome, shift him to a transplant center if possible. Of course, they need to be monetarily ready and they need to be mentally ready. I think that's the key issue. When not to do a liver transplant, there will be many situations that you have had a child who's come in late to you, and a transplant would be probably futile. So either if he has brain dead, or he's got multi-organ failure, or rampant sepsis, you cannot transplant this patient. Mitochondrial disorders, I've already mentioned to you. Some of these get exposed when you give them valproic acid. These are children who are developmental delay and have multiple seizures. Valproic is being given. They're going to acute liver failure. Transplanting them is probably not a good idea. HIV, this might change, but currently it is still a contraindication. So is a mentally retarded child and a child with Down syndrome. But these are up for discussion. Of course, a child who's got a malignancy is probably not a good candidate for transplant. I think in the future there should be more actions on prevention, and for us the most important would be hepatitis A vaccine. I was just mentioning to Mudit that only last month the government of India has now decided that they'll make hepatitis B vaccine mandatory. Forget hepatitis A. Hepatitis B vaccine is now going to be mandatory in the country. It used to be only 11 states till about a month ago. People have talked about hepatocyte transplantation, but getting good hepatocytes is a problem. So stem cells is probably the way to go. Bioartificial livers have been tried, but probably not a good option, at least in children when you have acute liver failure waiting for a transplantation because of increased incidence of sepsis. So what would your prescription look like? It will look something like this: fluids, vitamin K, anti-acid therapy, antibiotics, lactulose, avoidance of too much of fluids or diuretics, avoidance of false hope, and preparing the child for transplant if indicated. Thank you.